Welcome to Tapping Wisdom. I'm Sue Padernacht, and I'm delighted to return after 1 year of a break to complete my doctorate at the University of Southern California in organizational change and leadership. I'm resuming the Tapping Wisdom series with a new lineup and a fresh lineup of leaders doing incredible leading edge work in their various fields of expertise. With that, I'd like to introduce my friend and former colleague from University of California, Irvine Merage School of Business, Dr. Greg Autry. One of the things that he's focusing on is space leadership. Tell us what you're doing and what your background has been and how you got to doing this work.
Great. Well, thank you and congratulations, Dr. Padernacht.
Thank you.
Excited to be able to say that. As you mentioned, I was at UC Irvine, where I was originally an adjunct professor teaching entrepreneurship and macroeconomics. I was looking for research context way back in about 2002, 2003, when I started doing that. And I was particularly interested in what I saw evolving in the space industry, which was a new disruptive entrepreneurial thinking pattern there, and some companies, particularly in Mojave, California, a remote dusty desert town next to Edwards Air Force Base, where most of the action from the right stuff takes place. These old 1940s facilities were being taken over and converted by startups. So I wanted to study that, right? So I went ahead and started doing that as a potential case study area. I happened to get connected with the company that did the first human commercial space flight, a company called Scaled Composites, which actually flew somebody to space out of Mojave 3 times in 2004. And that connected me with a lot of these other companies that were going to be emerging. And I remember going back to UCI and saying to our colleagues, I'm studying the commercial space industry as an entrepreneurship context, and I got this head shaking. Now that's a government context, space is, and it's, even when there's companies involved, they're basically the military industrial complex. They're indistinguishable from the government. And I said, no, there's this guy I've met named Elon. I think you're going to hear from him someday. I remember that. Anyway, fast forward, did that, completed my PhD at UC Irvine when you were there, moved on to, in fact, teach in the Lloyd Greif Center for Entrepreneurial Studies at the Marshall School of Business at USC, where you then went to go to your PhD. A total coincidence, but 2 great institutions. And I had 7 years at USC, which I really loved. My research there in space continued. This resulted in me being appointed to the NASA agency review team, which, if you want, we could talk more about that from a leadership perspective, but that's part of the presidential transition team to determine what to do basically with space policy in the United States. That was 2016. Then I was nominated to be the chief financial officer at NASA in 2020. That's an interesting story in American politics, but we can talk about that too. Then I have landed at ASU, Arizona State University's Thunderbird School of Global Management, which is a historic international business school that had the courage to step up and put together a space leadership program, which I am proud to lead. It's an executive master's degree. It's almost kind of an MBA for space, is one way to look at it. Additionally, I am an instructor at the Institute for Security Science and Technology at Imperial College London, and I love engaging internationally and with our British colleagues there on space topics and security topics. On a side note, I served on the ComStack, the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee at FAA, which advises the U.S. government on regulation for launch and reentry of commercial spacecraft. And I still do work with NASA on the program called InSPA, the In-Space Production Applications, helping people bring commercial manufacturing to the space station. And I help review the business cases and lead the committee that looks at those business cases. So I think that sums up a lot of what I do, and I know it's a mouthful.
It does. So making the distinction in what you're saying into 2 buckets that I'm wondering if we can talk about each one separately. One is it looks like you're doing a lot to promote and inspire others to be in space leadership, like yourself, right? But like through the education that you're doing, and then you yourself, of course, are a leader, in the space industry, whether it's working with government or working with startup organizations in the for-profit world, etc. So I'm wondering if we would start first with yourself and your own experiences as a leader, for example, as the CFO at NASA when that began in 2020. And what is your interest? What is your vision? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? And what do you need to overcome in order to accomplish all of that?
Yeah, and I think there's an underlying question of why would you do any of that too. So I just want to rewind and say, 6-year-old Greg, I lived in a what was frankly a dysfunctional household. It was 1969. There were a lot of crazy things going on in this country, and if you get a chance to Google my Senate testimony on this topic, I addressed that. But our country seemed to be coming apart at the seams politically and socially. There was actually a pandemic that year. Hong Kong flu killed 100,000 people. I remember sitting in front of the TV set and watching Neil and Buzz step on the moon, and it was transformative for me. I think it was a serene and tranquil vision of a future where so many people work together to achieve something that was far beyond one person. And Neil's words about for all mankind, I think really resonated with me, that this was a global future. I was a huge Star Trek fan after that too, and so that kind of space nerd thing was always baked in. I couldn't get a job in space because I kind of came of age and career in the 1980s when things were being wound down post-Apollo and other issues were going on. It was hard to find jobs there. And so I went into software like a lot of my colleagues at the time did. In fact, I later found out people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk wanted to go to space as their primary goal, of course, but they ended up in software. And so there were a lot of people that way. Fast forward, I began to teach, and I was really interested in how do we help these new entrepreneurs that want to start space companies become functional leaders, and that's a role I was happy to help fulfill. And I've been excited about some of the people I've helped mentor, some of the people I've helped support with writings, testimonies to Congress, just networking and introductions for these folks, and whenever possible, educating them. Two great space leaders I really love from USC, Jordan Noon and Tim Ellis, founded a company called Relativity Space. And I remember working with them when they were students in the Rocket Propulsion Lab, and had the honor to occasionally mentor and advise them as they built their company up to what is now about a $5 billion organization. And that was amazing to watch some 20-something-year-olds do that, right? So sometimes it pans out, and you get that amazing feedback. And I've had a lot of other young entrepreneurs that I've spoken to found new companies. That's so rewarding, right? To help them find the leader within themselves, or just watch their natural leadership emerge and do great things.
And your leadership expertise spans from working with entrepreneurs to working with enormous government agencies.
Yeah.
So that's quite a span. So tell me a little bit about that.
Right. So I had the honor to be on the agency review team, which means basically go into NASA, see what programs there are, report back to the incoming administration. This was the Trump administration, about what we want to continue, anything we want to discontinue, what we want to expand, do we need more money, those sort of policy decisions in keeping with, in general, the president's statements during the campaign on the topic. And I had been lucky enough to, through a third party, kind of influence what those statements were. So they were in keeping with what I thought was important, which had a lot to do with engaging these entrepreneurial companies and more public-private partnerships. So that was exciting to do. I'm excited we actually got a budget increase of some significance for NASA for the first time in a long time. NASA budget had been just basically nominally flat at about $18 or $19 billion going back almost 30 years, and never adjusted for inflation or the growth of the size of government. So we were able to kick that up. I'm super pleased to say the Biden administration has continued that. And it's also important that they've continued all the policies that we put in place. It's the one area of policy continuity between the administrations, and the people that worked on the Trump team and the Biden team get along magnificently. And I'm always there to try to support the team that's at NASA now doing those things. We also made some other big decisions in space in general, or recommendations that were turned into decisions. These included setting up a National Space Council again, which was a structure that existed back in the 60s and 70s, where all the cabinet level people that had anything to do with space, the SecDef, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy now, and other folks, transportation, commerce, would all come together occasionally under the vice president to meet and discuss space policy. So I helped make that recommendation. The decision to return to the moon. I was an advocate for forming the United States Space Force, which we felt was really important. And I could talk more about that because it's greatly misunderstood, but nobody's building a Death Star. Right?
Sure. Why don't you continue with that thought?
Yeah. So the U.S. military obviously has a lot of interest in space. Many people said the 1992 Gulf War was the first space war because the U.S. used its space assets, particularly the new GPS system and communication systems, to just trounce the Iraqi military, which was, the Revolutionary Guard was highly regarded at that time, and they just got decimated because of the precision and accuracy of our systems, our communications, and the effectiveness of our troops on the ground with this space backing. Everybody else kind of saw that in the world and started creating dedicated space teams within their militaries, the Chinese, the Russians, many European countries have done that. The US, though, had its space assets spread across the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and they didn't work together as well as they ought to work together, right? And the procurement processes were inefficient and stymied inside large organizations. Air Force procurement is notoriously awful, frankly. And leadership, right? So you didn't have anybody at the top level that understood the domain. If you're going to become a top level leader in the United States Air Force, you're a fighter pilot, and that's basically guaranteed, right? And so people who went to Space Systems Command or other space-related activities in the Air Force never got to the top of management. So they were always trying to explain what they were doing to people who were much more interested in spending money on the F-35. And so we wanted to get these people out of the smaller, nimbler organization that brought together all of America's space capabilities in a responsive group. So that is essentially why Space Force. And at a time when this commercial activity is beginning to happen, and we're going to need to actually be able to protect U.S. commercial assets. Putin just a month or so ago actually threatened to shoot down U.S. commercial satellites that the Ukrainians were effectively using to counter his forces. This is SpaceX's Starlink communication system and imaging systems from Maxar and Planet that have allowed the Ukrainians to have almost military-grade intelligence of what's going on the battlefield. And so this is a new domain, so we need that.
Interesting. So as I'm listening to you, Greg, I'm wondering if you are one of the thought leaders out there who is trying to put some skin around the space ecosystem, between the entrepreneurial startups and and government and military and for-profit large corporations, that everything from from aerospace like Boeing to other manufacturers, etc., supply chain, all that stuff. So it sounds to me you're taking kind of more of a strategic, holistic approach, trying to put all those links together and also create a pipeline so that it's not just for the people who remember, when Buzz Aldrin was on the moon, right?
Yeah,
and that's the higher ed part. So talk to me about all of that.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there, right? First of all, yeah, the U.S. in particular, but in the world, we've got an amazing space ecosystem that includes big legacy companies in the United States. Those are Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, Rocketjet, Aerodyne, and Jacobs, and a whole bunch of subcontractors that have for years been providing excellent and exquisite systems that are those best systems in the world that help the U.S. military dominate for the last 30 years, right? As well as do amazing science for NASA. So we need to continue doing that, but we can bring in a lot of capabilities and lower the cost of many of these functions with commercial competitive companies that aren't operating under old school government cost plus contracts. I'm excited about the way that, to some extent, disruption and conflict occurs between these companies. It's also exciting to watch the incumbent companies adapt to the new thinking. A great example is United Launch Alliance, a joint venture of Boeing and Lockheed that's America's kind of legacy launch company. For years, they were the government's ride to space. They have done remarkable things under the leadership of Tory Bruno, a great leader who has helped transform that company in reaction to a very competitive market that he faces. So that's interesting. Then you made your point about bringing new people and everybody along, and this is a huge problem. Whenever I go to a space conference, you see a lot of people that look like me. It is a domain of middle-aged white guys, and it looks like the right stuff almost. And that said, it's also a domain where everybody loves the Star Trek vision of the future, and it is committed to an idea of bringing all humankind along, and wants to include everybody, but for whatever reason, everybody didn't necessarily see that as where they want to go. So how do we make the space domain much more open and inviting to a lot more people? It's part of what I do with my program. So I sit at a space conference and I'll see these people up in the panel saying, I can't hire a diverse leadership team because there are no women and there's not enough underrepresented minorities in the pipeline. They just don't exist. I can't do it. So how do we solve that? Most people have been saying, well, we need more programs to stimulate young minds. So they're focusing on K through 12, which is great, or STEM education for young women engineers. And that's great too, if you want to solve the problem 2 generations from now, as far as leadership is concerned. What can we do sooner? So I when I came to Thunderbird, I thought about that a lot. And I said, let's do an executive program, a 1-year program where I can take qualified people who are gender diverse and ethnically diverse and all the issues, experience diverse that we have from other industries, and embed them in the space domain for a year, connecting them with everybody they need to know, and giving them the education, the background they need, along with a master's degree, and put them out 1 year later as qualified space leaders. This solves that problem quickly, right? And so anyway, that's definitely part of why I'm doing what I want to do, and I can already see the benefits as our first cohort graduates, in fact, in 3 weeks.
Oh, congratulations. So can you tell me a little bit about the,
if you know anybody that wants to start in January?
Yes, and we're going to do shameless plugs. Shameless plugs for a new cohort starting in January at ASU. And we'll also put that information at the bottom as well, and information on how to contact you. Tell me a little bit about that cohort of people, or give me a story or two about how your vision of what that could be is getting actualized. Like, are they indeed going forward in the space and ecosystem, or have they decided, I think I'm going to bring this back and do something else?
No,
what's happening?
They're very much becoming thought leaders in that space ecosystem. And one of the things that was also in my vision is getting this diversity of thought and career experience in, because in the space industry, you have policymakers who make policy decisions, and frankly, they all went to George Washington or the Kennedy School to do policy studies. I'm going to plug GW, has an amazing space policy program led by Dr. Scott Pace, who led the National Space Council when I was there in DC. Great guy. But anyway, that's where they go. And then you've got finance people who go to the Ivy League finance schools or USC and study finance. And then you've got entrepreneurs who often don't have any formal education, or if they do, they tend to be at kind of West Coast Stanford sort of places, and they don't interact with each other until they get together in the real world. And you get the military people, they went to their military academies and they went to their military graduate schools. And now military people are making a procurement for some space thing from a group of entrepreneurs who are being financed by some investment bankers from New York. And none of these people have ever encountered each other before. And the thinking is so different. And I remember somebody from the Space Force saying to me, the entrepreneurs lied to me. That's because I teach the entrepreneurs to lie to you, sir. Right? I have $140 billion. Can you fulfill this need? And I taught them to say yes, and then leave the room and say, how the hell am I going to do that? And then they go lie to the investors on Wall Street to get the money to try to do what they don't know how to do for you, right? And if you understood that, you could make wiser decisions, right? But
Right.
you've dealt in that domain. And the bankers, understand entrepreneurs, but they don't understand the space context. So it's good. I've got them all in the classroom. So, I've got a partner from KPMG. I've got a brigadier general from the US Air Force. I have 20-something, startup entrepreneur, and they're all in the same classroom together. We put them on projects to solve real world problems in a situation that isn't a risk for them or their organization. And it's exciting to see that happen.
That's really exciting. And that leads to my question about your initiative, in addition to the Executive Master's Program in Space Leadership, Business, and Policy, to focus as for ASU Thunderbird to focus as a hub that brings, academia, scholarship, researchers, executives, policymakers, military officials all together, as a hub, not just as from an educational standpoint, but also to take some of that and to affect it in the space world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. What we want to do is, in addition to our education, do research that's beneficial to the industry, to the US government and other governments that are making investments in space. And we want to bring in companies that are willing to help sponsor that, because it will have positive ramifications for them. And they have research needs as well, where they want to understand these markets and the capabilities better. In particular, they want to look fast forward for 5, 10, 15 years and see where we're likely to be and make some decisions. This is a domain where things are very far out, both literally and figuratively. Yeah. So when you make an investment in lunar resource mining, you might be talking a 25-year return, and that's hard to sell in the venture capital world, right?
Did you actually say lunar resource mining?
Yeah.
Can you say more about what that means?
Sure. So the moon is the size of Africa, right? Oh, and luckily, yeah, there's nobody living on it. So the surface area of the moon is equivalent to it is chock full of things like rare earth elements and potentially energy sources that are literally out of this world and can't be found on Earth. And it's full of the resources that we need to go farther into the solar system, which includes things as simple as water ice, right? Because when you're in space, you need water. You need oxygen, which you can pull out of water, and you can pull hydrogen out of water, which is in many ways the best rocket fuel. So these resources are up there. There is a quiet scramble going on for them. In fact, there's a great book called Scramble for the Skies by Dr. Namatra Goswami, who teaches in my program. And she's looking at this particular issue, but essentially the Chinese, the Americans, to a lesser extent the Russians, and a bunch of other countries are all getting ready for the lunar land grab, right? So how can we start extracting these valuable resources first and set up areas of influence, essentially. The current international law prevents the claims of sovereignty on the moon and doesn't provide for the ownership of private property, but it does provide for non-interference. So you could set up an exclusion zone once you get there and basically grab those resources. So this is a really interesting thing. There are a lot of investors interested in it. There was a first generation of investors founded companies like Planetary Resources, which had James Cameron, of all people, as a major investor. That company went bust. They were going to go mine asteroids. But we can do great things in space that will relieve the pressure on the Earth by moving extractive industries and dirty industries off the planet. The moon is the first place to do that. Allow the Earth to take a breather, and instead of ripping up the Brazilian rainforest to find some rare earth elements, we can pull out an asteroid core in the bottom of a sterile crater on the moon.
Right, and of course there are scientists who are looking at, what might be the consequences of that, hopefully minimal or nothing. And I'm sure there are legal scholars who are thinking about, who gets to claim what, and what partnerships look like, that are kind of beyond the scope of this discussion. But those things kind of occur to me
Oh
as
yeah, there's the whole
big open holes, right?
political policy thing going on, right? The Russians hate the idea of any commercial activity in space. The Americans want to see private enterprise and mostly private capital put in there, so the taxpayers don't have to pay for it. Chinese are kind of in between, and so it's a very interesting domain to be in right now.
Right. And so Greg, you have clearly like made a dent in the universe, as they say, with regard to, the ecosystem, everything from research to business to education. I'm wondering if we could shift a focus onto you and your leadership. What is it about your leadership capabilities and capacity that you think helped you and enabled you to kind of make some of that dent in the universe and impact and influence and continue to impact and influence the space industry?
Wow. So, you're the expert on leadership, research perspective, but there are definitely some leaders who, like I think Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, to an extent, are lone wolf leaders, right? So they want to create and establish organizations full of people that follow their vision and execute on that. I tend to prefer to be not necessarily unseen, but more of a contributor helping push leaders into the direction they need to go. And you don't always have to agree with those leaders 100%, but sure, sometimes if you can make the right case, and within the US government, this is certainly possible, you can get great outcomes from a variety of different people. So like I said, that one thing that the Biden team and the Trump team totally agree on happens to be space policy in most aspects. And nobody would necessarily think that. But I hosted an event in Florida in August for the launch of the Artemis 1 project, the originally scheduled launch at Kennedy Space Center. And, I reached into my Rolodex and I brought in Jim Bridenstine, who was President Trump's NASA administrator. I got General Charlie Bolden, who was President Obama's NASA administrator, Bahavia Lal, who was the head of the Biden transition team. And, they were all in the same room together, having these discussions about how we move forward together. At the end of the program, I've got this great photo. They're all hugging. Could you imagine the Biden, Trump, and Obama team leaders in any other department in the U.S. government hugging?
I'm going to applaud you for that.
It's those sort of little subtle things I like to do as a leader, and gain the respect of people by adding value to their lives. So I've done things for these people that they found valuable, and when I pick up the phone and call them, I can get them to come and we can all work on the thing we care about together. So it's that kind of behind the curtains leadership to some extent that I like.
You show the power behind the power.
I don't even want to say that, but the facilitator.
A facilitator, yeah.
I want to be the facilitator.
Yeah. So, and I'm also recognizing that you're able to actualize your vision by influencing in a common interest kind of a way, right? So, kind of shredding away the politics, which doesn't necessarily have to have a place there, right? I mean, yeah, maybe, budget allocation, and there could be arguments about that. But in terms of like what the whole purpose of this is, which is to advance humankind and to, find other resources and to see what else is out there and all of that, all of the positive things that we gain from space, you're able to kind of coalesce people who are otherwise on different sides of the aisle onto a common vision, and that could hopefully have reaches in other areas beyond space. It could also have reaches in places here on Earth as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's just good demonstrating that we can work together and actually get something done in the United States. So that's great. And NASA has always been a shining star. If you look at public polls on which governmental agencies they like. It's pretty much the National Park System and NASA, right? A lot of people voting for the IRS, right? And you look at the federal employees, most desirable place to work, it's always NASA, like every year for, I don't know, 15 years or however long they've taken that poll, it's always NASA. So it's served as a shining city on the hill to the better natures we have. Now, that said, there are politics, they tend to be parochial. So it's California versus Alabama, Texas, Florida, the kind of space states who are looking for jobs, right? And for contracts for their companies and their states and associated revenues. And that's always going to be a thing. And you totally have to understand that when you want to go achieve some goal within the system. And people who don't, there's a lot of people out there, I'm fanboys of whatever company or individual who's, highly noted in the space domain, and they want to like ignore or, even cancel the programs that are supporting anybody else. That's not the way that you get something done. The way that you get something done is you convince the people who allocate money in the US government that we have an important mission to the government of the United States, to the taxpayers of the United States, and an obligation to future generations in the world. Please fund this and make sure there's enough money for everybody. That's how you do that.
And what I appreciate
America can afford to have a future.
Yes, and a future that that's actually a perfect segue for a point that I wanted to bring back from earlier. That is inclusive of everyone. That that is representative of our population. From a gender, from a race, ethnicity, etc. Gender expression. All right, that it's inclusive. Today and going forward.
Yeah. We want our future vision supported. We need to bring everybody along. So just on a purely selfish standpoint, excluding anybody from that vision is not going to work, right? But on a more altruistic standpoint, there's so much to be gained, and we want to share that. On the Trump team, we very specifically decided we want to return to the moon, and the decision was made very clearly that the next American to step foot on the moon would be a woman, right? And we didn't want to create a situation where we're just going to have some woman repeat what the men did 50 years ago, because frankly, that's embarrassing, I think. That's not what you want. We want that woman to go do something new and amazing, right, and have that opportunity. And so we're returning to the moon on a permanent, sustainable basis, which is part of the national space policy. It's super important. We're not going to do flags and footprints, which was Apollo. We're going to go there, do our thing, and not come back. We're going up there to stay and develop those resources for everybody, and we need everybody to come along. So the Biden administration went forward with that. The program under the Trump administration, if you're not aware, was named Artemis, which is the twin sister of Apollo. So it was a perfect symbolism there in that. And the Biden administration has continued it, and they've also noted that they intend to bring a person of color as well. And I've already seen that we've made an announcement with the Japanese Space Agency. We're taking a Japanese astronaut to the moon, so it'll be international as well. And I couldn't be more excited about that Star Trek vision of the future there.
That's very exciting. So Greg, I just wanted to begin to wrap up. So this is, we could kind of keep going on lots of those different things, and I just wanted to let our audience know I have been a Star Trek fan for many years, and this is a fun book to read about leadership lessons from Star Trek Generations. Shameless plug. So Greg, let me start with, what have I not asked that would be interesting or helpful for our listeners to know about any of the things that we talked about?
Wow, what have you not asked? We've covered a lot of territory here very quickly. I think the internationalism is super important. One of the things that we realized when we wanted to go back to the moon sustainably and permanently is we didn't want to repeat Apollo. One of the biggest problems with Apollo was, although it brought everybody in the world together and along for the ride, even in the midst of the Cold War, it was a purely American project, right? And there wasn't a lot of opportunity for other countries to participate. So we wanted Artemis to be international from the get-go. And so a couple things have happened there. One is a hardware component of this system called the Lunar Gateway, a kind of small international space station in space, will engage people from many different countries. Originally, there, in fact, was going to be a major contribution by the Russians. That looks like that's not going to happen for obvious reasons. And I think they're going to go run off and join the Chinese, and maybe they can recruit the Iranians and North Koreans and have an access to the evil space base. But sorry,
that's pretty terrifying.
Working with the space agency, with the Japanese, Koreans, and we've got a new project called Artemis Accords, which was developed during the Trump administration and greatly expanded during the Biden administration to create bilateral agreements between the United States and other countries, and that is now at 21 countries. I know two more, but I've actually been helping with one of them quite a bit that I think are about to sign. I can't say who they are, but we'll be 23, and I think that's just going to keep growing. That have agreed to work with each other in the U.S. to develop the moon in a sustainable and copacetic manner, to have agreed standards for interoperability of equipment and to communications, rescue if anybody on the moon needs rescue, and to start to work together so that we can establish best principles of lunar activity going forward. And that's a totally different way of looking at it, and I'm really excited with where that's going.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. So if we were to pull this all together for people who are listening, and they really haven't known a lot about space and the space ecosystem, you know, for today, and what it is, why it is, and you know what the future looks like. What are, like, two or three like major takeaways you could people can walk away with that they didn't know before?
Wow. Well, first of all, another, to some extent, shameless plug, but find my writings on foreign policy, the magazine, and space news, and Forbes. I write for all those places fairly regularly. Lots of stuff on this. The point I want to hit again, I mentioned briefly, was that we make the Earth a better place by developing space. This isn't an either or. There's some people who are intentionally misleading the public by pretending that billionaires want to leave the Earth and go to Mars. Look, the very, very best day on Mars is worse than the very, very worst day in Antarctica, right? It's not a pleasant place to go. People that want to go there are daring and intrepid explorer sorts. But when they get there, they're going to develop resources and opportunities that are going to benefit us back here. And the faster we can stop ripping up the rainforest for metals, or employing child labor to rip cobalt out of the ground in Africa, and move our energy platforms to things that make sense, including space solar power and potentially helium-3, a product on the moon that can help facilitate fusion. The sooner that we can make the Earth, and this is very much Jeff Bezos's view, why he's going to space, a national park, basically, right? Because it's the only place we know in the entire universe that has life on it. We think we might find, I don't know, a bacteria living, under a rock on Mars, and that would be exciting. We have an obligation to protect this amazing green planet and everything that lives on it, and help that biosphere expand. I gave a talk at Oxford earlier this year at the Oxford Union. And I said, I'm the envoy for Earth's biosphere. The biosphere created me to help extend its reach. And so eventually I think we'll have people and plants and animals from the Earth living on the moon, Mars, and beyond. And that's a good thing, because bad things happen. And, Elon Musk talks a lot about this, that an asteroid could hit the Earth. We could destroy ourselves in a nuclear war. We could develop dangerous nanobot swarms, or a bioengineered pandemic, or gosh knows what. But the goal is not to leave the Earth. It's to protect the Earth and to create some backups for the day when inevitably something very bad happens here.
Yeah. And so thank you so much, Greg. I so appreciate you enlightening everyone, myself included. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and just lack of information about what this is and why it's important. So thank you for enlightening us and educating us. So thank you. How might our listeners get in touch with you?
I think the best way is to search me out on LinkedIn. You could, where I talk a lot about leadership and business development things. If you want a more robust political conversation, you can find me on Twitter. But be careful, I'm Greg W. Autry. There's another gentleman named Greg Autry who looks a lot like me, but he isn't a rock photographer. And sometimes I think I'm jealous of that, but that's not me.
Well, thank you, Greg. And thank you all for listening. This has been Tapping Wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.